That morning unfolded with a quiet intensity that settled in my chest long before I reached the courthouse doors, and I knew I was walking into a moment that would redraw every line in my life. My name is Casey Donovan, and I had spent the previous nights organizing 3 worn folders that became the only shield I trusted. When I stepped inside the courtroom holding them tightly, the first thing I saw was the look my family gave me, a look so familiar that it barely surprised me. My parents sat together with my older brother beside them, and the three of them exchanged the kind of smirks that carried years of dismissal. I wore the only suit I still owned, a faded one I bought before I ever understood how expensive standing up for yourself could be. I felt their eyes drag across it with silent judgment, yet my grip on the folders held steady, because I understood something they never believed. I had come prepared. Their attorney positioned himself with the confidence of a man certain he already knew the ending, and the sight of him leaning forward as if victory was effortless nearly made me laugh. For a brief moment I looked toward the judge's bench and steadied my breathing, reminding myself why I was here. This was not simply about the $3.3 million trust they were trying to seize through a conservatorship petition. It was about proving that I was no longer the version of myself they had spent years undermining. I knew the words I was about to say would shift the room in a way none of them saw coming, and that thought alone kept me standing tall. If you have ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to believe in you, stay with me. This story will show you exactly what happens when you finally decide to fight for yourself. Growing up in my parents' house taught me early that conversations about money always carried a weight that settled into the walls of our home, and the tension it created never truly disappeared, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. My brother Marcus stood at the center of that tension, because Mom and Dad believed he held an instinctive talent for financial decisions, even though he never once demonstrated the steady habits needed to justify their confidence. I watched him make choices that benefited him in the moment, while I quietly handled my own expenses with care. Yet the narrative within our home painted him as capable, and painted me as someone who needed guidance. It created a heavy imbalance that followed me into adulthood, and the pattern took root long before I ever had the language to identify it. I learned to budget on my own because I had no expectation that Mom or Dad would offer support without attaching strings that pulled tighter each time I tried to stand independently. I paid for textbooks, medical appointments, groceries, and rent, while Marcus floated comfortably above responsibility. Yet the moment any issue related to finances surfaced, their eyes shifted toward me with the same familiar concern that never matched reality. The most frustrating part came from how deeply they believed the story they had built. Not once did they stop to question why the daughter who managed every bill on her own would suddenly become incapable simply because they decided she should be. When Grandma passed and left a $3.3 million trust solely under my name, the uneasy atmosphere inside our home became impossible to ignore because the decision challenged the structure my parents relied on. They never said anything directly yet. Their reactions revealed the discomfort they did not bother hiding. Marcus acted surprised, but his silence felt calculated. Mom tried to smile even though her expression faltered, and Dad asked questions that revealed more about his intentions than about any genuine curiosity. My inheritance shifted the ground beneath us, and none of them handled that shift with the honesty the situation required. Their favoritism toward Marcus became even more obvious once Grandma's decision became final. Every discussion they had about the trust occurred in tones they assumed I would not notice, although the certainty in their voices betrayed a belief that Marcus deserved control simply because he had always been placed at the center of family decisions. I had spent years adjusting myself around their preferences, yet this was the first time I understood how far they were willing to go to maintain an order that benefited them. The realization pushed me into a clearer sense of independence, not because I wanted distance, but because the distance felt necessary for my own stability. I gradually stopped sharing personal information about my finances because I knew any detail, no matter how small, could be twisted into proof that I required oversight. I locked documents, organized my accounts privately, and learned to respond carefully whenever Mom asked questions that sounded casual but carried an edge of suspicion. Dad approached things differently. He framed his concerns as attempts to guide me, yet every suggestion steered toward a future where Marcus would somehow play a role in managing what belonged solely to me. Their combined pressure began to form a pattern that made me increasingly protective of anything involving money. The tension remained quiet until it surfaced through comments that pretended to express care. They spoke about the importance of protecting me from financial mistakes, although they never once asked what decisions I had made or why I trusted my own judgment. Those conversations repeated until the space between us thickened, creating an understanding that their concern was not about my well-being, but about preserving the version of me they preferred. Each remark carried the implication that I could not be trusted, and the weight of those assumptions shaped the beginning of the conflict that eventually brought us into the courtroom. 2 years before the hearing, everything began to shift in ways I had never anticipated, and the stability I was building felt both fragile and essential at the same time. I had settled into my position at a small financial firm in Charleston after months of searching for a workplace where I could grow without the pressure of my family's expectations. The job was modest, yet it allowed me to create a routine that made sense to me. I spent long hours reviewing reports, speaking with clients, and studying patterns that helped me feel grounded. For the first time in years, I sensed that I was shaping a life that belonged entirely to me. I felt proud of the structure I created, and even small victories held meaning because they came from my effort rather than the approval I could never earn at home. Mom did not understand why I wanted that independence, and she made her concerns known in subtle comments that appeared during ordinary conversations. She often suggested that my older brother Marcus could help guide my financial decisions because she believed he handled money with more confidence. Her tone usually carried the same gentle insistence she used whenever she wanted to redirect my choices. I told her that I had everything under control, yet she continued emphasizing the idea that Marcus had a natural sense of responsibility. Each remark chipped away at the space I tried to build, and I grew more aware of how deeply she trusted him, even when no evidence supported that trust. Dad approached the issue with a more direct strategy by asking me to share access to my accounts. He mentioned wanting to ensure I stayed on track, but the way he phrased his request made it clear he wanted oversight rather than reassurance. I declined without hesitation because I knew what would follow if I allowed that door to open. He repeated his request several times over the following weeks, each time with a slightly sharper tone. I felt pressured, yet I refused to give in. My financial stability was the result of years of effort, and I was unwilling to sacrifice that progress to satisfy fears that did not reflect reality. Marcus inserted himself into the conversation soon after, claiming he only wanted to help me navigate responsibilities that he assumed were too much for me. His confidence in asserting that opinion startled me because he had never shown interest in my life before. His sudden involvement revealed a desire that went beyond concern. He asked questions about the trust despite having no connection to it, and he spoke as if he already deserved a role in its future. His comments shifted from vague suggestions to pointed statements that hinted at control. I recognized his ambition, and the realization unsettled me more than I expected. The situation escalated when my parents presented me with a stack of documents they wanted me to sign. Their explanation was wrapped in calm words that did little to mask the intention behind them. They insisted that granting Marcus authority to support the management of my assets would give everyone peace of mind. Their insistence created a tense atmosphere that made my refusal feel like an act of rebellion. I read every line carefully and saw wording that would reduce my autonomy, so I pushed the papers back toward them. Marcus reacted with frustration, accusing me of being unreasonable. Mom looked disappointed, and Dad stared as if he could change my mind through silence alone. That moment forced me to protect the progress I had made, so I created distance to preserve my stability. I stopped attending family gatherings unless necessary, limited phone calls, and focused on strengthening the independence I fought to build. The separation came with a sense of relief that surprised me, and I realized that stepping back was the only way to maintain control of the life I had worked so hard to claim. 9 months before the hearing, the tension surrounding my family shifted into something that felt more purposeful, as if every move they made carried a quiet intention I had not recognized before. During that period, my firm introduced a restructuring plan that caused several departments to rotate responsibilities. I moved into a compliance position where I spent each day reviewing contracts, studying regulatory updates, and examining internal procedures. The work demanded focus and discipline, yet it gave me an understanding of financial oversight that reshaped the way I saw my situation at home. I learned how evaluations were formed, how risk was measured, and how documentation could influence decisions that affected someone's future. That knowledge allowed me to see patterns that I had previously dismissed as discomfort, rather than warning signs. My parents invited me to a dinner they described as an opportunity to reconnect, and I accepted because I hoped that setting boundaries earlier had eased the strain. I chose a small restaurant near their neighborhood, expecting a quiet evening, yet the atmosphere changed the moment I sat down. Mom offered a warm smile that did not reach her eyes, and Dad maintained a tone that sounded prepared rather than relaxed. Their conversation felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced the rhythm of each sentence. After a few minutes, Dad placed a folder on the table with the same careful motion he used whenever he wanted to control the pace of a discussion. He explained that the documents would help the family move forward. Mom nodded with conviction, while emphasizing that signing would simplify the future. I opened the folder and recognized wording that would adjust the structure of the trust. The realization settled heavily, and I understood that the dinner had little to do with reconciliation. Lydia joined us later that evening because she happened to be in the area, and she walked in with a sense of ease that contrasted the tension surrounding the table. She greeted each of us before taking a seat next to me, and her presence softened the atmosphere enough for me to regain clarity. As the conversation shifted toward casual topics, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. She mentioned hearing that Marcus had been asking questions regarding financial evaluations, specifically ones that could portray me as someone lacking stability. Her tone carried quiet concern, and she encouraged me to stay alert. Lydia's warning unsettled me because she rarely involved herself in sensitive matters unless she believed the situation required attention. Marcus appeared increasingly confident during the following weeks as he discussed decisions he believed I would eventually allow him to make. He spoke as if every detail of my financial life required his guidance, and he referenced information he had no reason to know. I later discovered that he had contacted a financial evaluator named Carl Whitmore, a man known for producing aggressive assessments when hired to support a particular narrative. When I learned that Marcus had asked Carl to prepare a report about my financial habits, the pieces began to connect. The intent behind the evaluation was not accuracy but advantage. Carl's reputation suggested he would not hesitate to interpret any minor choice as evidence of mismanagement, and Marcus seemed willing to rely on that approach to strengthen his position. The situation revealed that my family had been coordinating their efforts for longer than I realized. Each conversation request and suggestion began to resemble parts of a broader plan that aimed to shape an image of me that suited their purpose. I recognized the possibility that they were constructing a case designed to justify their involvement in the trust. The realization did not shock me as much as the ease with which they embraced the narrative. Their confidence suggested that they believed I would react passively, yet my reaction differed from the version of me they expected. I decided to gather information quietly rather than confront them directly. Compliance work trained me to document patterns and preserve evidence, so I applied those skills to my situation. I reviewed statements, organized timelines, and saved records that could clarify decisions I had made. I avoided revealing anything to my parents or Marcus because I suspected any reaction from me would prompt them to accelerate their efforts. Maintaining silence became essential because it allowed me to observe their plans without contributing to them. The distance I created earlier gave me room to prepare without interference, and each step helped me understand the importance of staying composed while navigating the path they chose to take. 6 weeks before the hearing, the pressure surrounding the situation grew sharper, and I realized that the only way to protect myself was to prepare with absolute precision. I spent each evening reviewing documents that stretched back several years because I wanted every detail to be supported by records that demonstrated clarity and consistency. I gathered bank statements, tax filings, transaction histories, and confirmation letters that validated decisions I had made during each financial cycle. The process required long hours, yet it gave me control over information that my family assumed I would ignore. Their belief that I lacked discipline strengthened my determination to prepare a case built on facts rather than emotion. Each folder I created became proof that their assumptions had never aligned with reality. During those weeks, my best friend Jenna became the only person I allowed near the situation. She visited after work with takeout because she wanted me to keep my energy steady while I organized the material. I trusted her enough to explain the depth of the problem, and she listened without interrupting since she understood how difficult it had become to separate shock from clarity. Jenna encouraged me to trust my judgment because she believed my understanding of compliance work gave me an advantage. Her support grounded me when exhaustion made the situation feel heavier than I could manage. She reminded me that preparation was not only necessary, but also a way to reclaim confidence that my family had chipped away for years. One evening, Lydia called and asked to meet in a quiet cafe near her office. She greeted me with a look that suggested urgency, and she explained that she had acquired information I needed to see immediately. She opened her tablet and revealed a folder containing copies of emails between Marcus and Whitmore. The messages showed their attempts to influence the language of a financial report that had not yet been completed. They discussed framing decisions I made as erratic, even when those decisions aligned with standard guidance. The emails confirmed that they were not seeking fairness, but rather an outcome that placed control in their hands. Lydia scrolled through several more messages and emphasized that the situation was escalating quickly. Her willingness to share the documents gave me proof that their narrative had been created intentionally rather than through misunderstanding. The more I read, the clearer it became that I could not rely on a lawyer who might overlook the weaknesses hidden in those documents. I realized that representing myself in the hearing would allow me to control the direction of each argument. I spent nights studying legal procedures because I wanted to understand how evidence should be presented, how objections were structured, and how credibility was evaluated. I took notes on case law that involved trust disputes because I wanted to identify patterns that resembled mine. The work required focus that stretched beyond comfort, yet I preferred exhaustion over vulnerability. Once I made the decision to represent myself, I created 3 separate folders that would structure the foundation of my argument. The first folder contained evidence outlining Whitmore's irregularities, including inconsistencies in his prior evaluations. The second folder included documentation that proved the stability of my financial decisions across several years. The third folder covered procedural errors committed by Marcus during his attempts to initiate changes without proper authorization. I reviewed each section repeatedly until I knew the material well enough to explain it clearly without hesitation. Every document served a purpose, and I wanted the judge to see that my decisions were rooted in responsibility rather than instability. While I focused on preparation, my family began spreading rumors that painted me as someone incapable of managing responsibility. They suggested that I lacked emotional control and claimed that I made financial choices without considering consequences. Hearing those statements through acquaintances felt surreal because the accusations contradicted every fact in my possession. Their willingness to distort the truth reinforced my commitment to address their claims directly in the hearing. I understood that silence would allow their version of the story to grow, so I chose to let my evidence speak for me. The closer the hearing approached, the more certain I became that preparation was my strongest defense. I realized that the documents I gathered were not only protection, but also a reflection of how hard I had worked to build stability without recognition. Each night reminded me that strength often forms quietly long before anyone expects it. The morning of the hearing arrived, with a stillness that felt heavier than any fear I had carried throughout the long months before. I walked toward the courthouse with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that retreat was no longer possible. The folders I prepared felt weightier than their actual mass because they represented every hour spent gathering the truth that my family believed I would never uncover. When I entered the courtroom, I sensed a shift in the air that signaled this day would determine far more than the management of a trust. It would determine whether their version of me would continue to define my life or finally be dismantled in a place where evidence mattered more than manipulation. Mom took her seat with an expression that suggested certainty, while Dad carried the same look of confidence he used whenever he believed control belonged exclusively to him. Marcus watched me with a smirk that implied he had already decided the outcome. His posture communicated triumph, as if my presence in an old suit confirmed the story he had prepared with such ease. The three of them sat together in flawless alignment, and I realized they expected the hearing to reinforce their assumptions rather than challenge them. Kerrigan adjusted his tie before opening the binder he had prepared. His voice carried the tone of someone rehearsed in presenting arguments that sounded polished, even when the foundations beneath them were fragile. He summarized their position as though the narrative flowed naturally from fact to conclusion, and he maintained an air of composure that suggested the court should accept each statement without scrutiny. He referenced Whitmore's evaluation with confidence, treating it as a reliable professional assessment despite the obvious gaps in methodology that were visible to anyone trained to examine compliance records. I waited until he finished before requesting permission to address the court. Judge Roberta Ellis nodded, and I presented the first set of documents with deliberate clarity. I asked her to examine the evaluation signed by Whitmore, and then noted that he had never met me at any point during the process. I described the standard procedures required for an assessment of that kind, and highlighted the absence of interviews, verifications, or reviews that would normally accompany such a report. I explained each omission in measured detail because I wanted the judge to see that the flaws were not minor oversights, but deliberate choices that aligned with Marcus's intentions. When I presented the emails, the courtroom grew noticeably quieter. The messages displayed direct communication, in which Marcus encouraged Whitmore to shape the conclusions in a direction that favored their argument even when the data did not support it. I explained how the language in the messages indicated collaboration rather than impartial evaluation, and I pointed to timestamps showing the sequence that confirmed intent. The judge examined the pages with a concentration that gave me confidence. She understood the significance of the correspondence. I then presented documentation showing the date the summons had been mailed to me. I explained the statutory deadlines for notifications required by the state, and I outlined how the delay restricted my ability to respond in a timely manner. The violation of procedural requirements became clear when the judge compared the relevant dates. I explained that although I had still prepared thoroughly, the attempt to shorten my preparation window reflected the same pattern present throughout their actions. As the material accumulated, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. Judge Ellis began asking questions that Kerrigan struggled to answer with the same smoothness he displayed earlier. She requested clarification on the inconsistencies between their statements and the documents I presented. His responses shifted from confident to hesitant because he could not reconcile the evidence with the narrative they had constructed. Each question from the judge forced him further away from the polished lines he had rehearsed. For the first time that morning, I felt the weight on my shoulders lighten. It did not disappear, but it shifted just enough to remind me that truth, when presented clearly and patiently, had its own momentum. I realized that I had not walked into the courtroom alone. I had walked in with every fact they believed I would never find the strength to gather. An hour into the hearing, a noticeable shift settled across the room, as though the weight of the evidence had finally reached its breaking point. The tension no longer hid behind polite expressions or rehearsed arguments, and the sense of inevitability grew sharper with each moment Judge Ellis reviewed the documents spread across her desk. I watched her study the pages with a calm intensity that revealed nothing yet suggested everything. The courtroom remained still long enough for me to understand that whatever happened next would close a chapter I had carried far longer than I ever intended. Judge Ellis placed the final document aside before requesting that everyone rise. Her voice carried a clarity that silenced every whisper when she delivered her ruling. She stated that the petition for conservatorship was denied in its entirety due to multiple procedural violations and deliberate attempts to manipulate the legal process. She explained that the evidence showed clear intent to orchestrate an inaccurate evaluation for financial gain. Her tone remained composed, yet there was no misinterpreting the firmness behind her words. She condemned the misuse of legal systems designed to protect those who genuinely required assistance rather than control those who simply refused to be managed. She noted that the emails between Marcus and Whitmore demonstrated purposeful coordination that raised serious ethical concerns, and she announced that the matter would be forwarded to investigators for further review. The look on Marcus's face shifted from confidence to disbelief as the weight of his decisions settled across the space between us. His certainty dissolved so quickly that I almost felt the shock ripple through him in real time. The courtroom atmosphere thickened as he attempted to remain composed, but the consequences arrived faster than he expected. Judge Ellis then addressed Mom and Dad regarding the financial transfers that appeared in the supplemental documents I submitted. She requested a formal accounting of each transaction and demanded transparency regarding the sources and destinations of the funds routed through Marcus's accounts. Her tone made it clear that this was no longer a family dispute, but a matter with legal and financial implications that they would need to explain without relying on emotional defenses. The confidence they carried into the courtroom gradually faded into a muted tension that neither attempted to disguise. Kerrigan attempted to respond on their behalf, yet Judge Ellis interrupted him to address his role directly. She stated that he had submitted documents without verifying their legitimacy and reminded him of his ethical obligations when representing clients in cases involving financial evaluations. She issued a formal reprimand and instructed him to review professional conduct regulations before proceeding with any future filings. His composure faltered, and the confidence he displayed earlier diminished under the scrutiny of the judge's questions. When she invited me to speak, I requested reimbursement for every expense I had incurred while preparing to defend myself. I explained the number of hours required to compile the documents and the necessity of handling the case personally to correct the falsehoods in the materials submitted against me. Judge Ellis reviewed the receipts before granting the request, and she added that the payment would be mandatory given the misconduct evident throughout their petition. Her approval felt like a validation of every sleepless night spent piecing together the fragments of their plan. As the hearing concluded, Mom approached me with an expression I had not seen in years. She asked whether we could put everything behind us and rebuild the relationship we once had. Her voice carried a softness that might have moved me in another lifetime. I told her that I wished her well, yet I no longer had room for relationships rooted in control rather than respect. I explained that forgiveness did not require returning to the environment that caused the harm. She listened without arguing, though the disappointment in her eyes lingered. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. The judgment settled the dispute, but the consequences reshaped the boundaries I needed to protect myself. For the first time, the future no longer felt pre-written by someone else's expectations. it finally felt like mine. 3 months later, the rhythm of my days settled into a steadiness that felt earned rather than borrowed. The silence in my new neighborhood in Charleston carried a different tone from the one I had grown used to, and the space around me finally felt undisturbed by expectations that were never mine to carry. I chose a small townhouse near the marsh and spent the first few weeks learning how to let an ordinary morning feel like progress. It surprised me how quickly the absence of conflict could reshape the entire texture of a life. The news about Marcus reached me through public records long before anyone decided to mention it directly. The investigation concluded that his involvement with Whitmore violated a series of ethical standards, and the firm where he worked decided to terminate his position without offering any form of reinstatement. I read the report once before putting it away, and I understood that whatever consequences he now faced belonged entirely to him. The impulse to fix things or shoulder responsibility never surfaced, and I realized that was a proof of how far I had come. Mom and Dad encountered their own share of difficulties once the financial audit began. The state required them to return several transfers they had made on Marcus's behalf, and the penalties placed additional pressure on their already fragile situation. They attempted to reach out through distant relatives, yet I remained firm in my choice to maintain distance. I no longer viewed their struggles with the familiar blend of guilt and obligation that once followed me everywhere. I acknowledged the pain they caused without allowing it to dictate the direction of my future. The only person I continued speaking to was Lydia. She respected the boundaries I set, and never attempted to persuade me back into a family dynamic that harmed me for years. Our conversations remained gentle, focused on simple updates rather than emotional negotiations. She reminded me that sometimes the healthiest form of loyalty is choosing not to repeat the same wounds out of habit. Her presence offered a sense of grounding during moments when the quiet around me carried more weight than usual. I used a small portion of the trust to stabilize my new routine, although I kept the majority of it untouched. I wanted the fun to represent the version of myself that I fought so hard to protect, rather than serve as a reminder of the chaos that once surrounded it. I prioritized decisions that brought clarity rather than conflict, and I built a schedule that balanced work solitude and the gradual rebuilding of friendships I had neglected while navigating the turmoil. As the weeks passed, I reaffirmed a truth I had avoided confronting for years. The relationship I once hoped to salvage with Mom, Dad, and Marcus no longer existed in a form I recognized or trusted. It felt strange to release the hope that had once kept me tethered to them, yet the relief that followed proved it was the right decision. I did not carry anger, only an understanding that the version of me they tried to control no longer existed. I ended each evening with a quiet certainty that the life unfolding in front of me finally belonged to me. The past no longer dictated the terms of my choices, and the shadows of the courtroom had faded into something resembling closure. I stepped into each day without fear that someone else would attempt to rewrite my future, and that sense of ownership became the foundation of everything that came next. The months that followed taught me that protecting your peace is not an act of selfishness, but an act of survival when the people who should value you choose control instead of care. Standing alone can feel frightening at first, yet it often becomes the moment you finally see your own strength without distortion. Trust is meaningful only when it is earned, and boundaries matter most when others insist on crossing them. Healing begins when you stop apologizing for choosing yourself. Thank you for staying with me through the final chapter of this story. Your presence means more than you know, especially when a journey like this invites reflection on family trust and the courage to walk away. I truly value the time you spent listening to every detail. I would love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, or your perspective. Share your view in the comments, and let us continue this conversation together.